If you choose maths at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, because that's an area which is priority for your school, and obviously it's based on the guidance report. You have got on your table, as for the English with the maths, kind of suggested PLC foci for next year. But as I said earlier, we've already decided that we're thinking about changing it slightly anyway, but it gives you an idea. What we will be asking the schools to do, and for those who are involved in the TA project starting in 2016, you remember you all completed a RAG rating at the beginning, self-assessment, and we're going to use that as an assessment tool to kind of shape the direction of the year, really, and say actually what are the priorities, because there's no point ploughing through recommendation 4 if everybody actually is fine with that, so it's not a focus for your schools. So we will be using that to shape the direction in which the project goes through the year. But we will be starting with the first recommendation, logically enough, which looks at assessment. And the broader evidence from the marked improvement, which Anna's already alluded to with feedback and marking. The beauty for us sitting in our sort of Mobilise team and in our office is that we talk to each other all the time, obviously, about the different choices, and where there is overlap, hopefully it comes through to your school-based leads and into the classrooms. Where those overlaps are quite obvious to somebody who's got the overview of all the different projects, we're able to bring learning from different choices. So there will be lots of overlap with the metacognition, with the feedback in particular, so that will filter through. So if you're concerned about not choosing, a bit of this or that one sounds interesting, then obviously we can talk about the priorities for your school, because there will be elements of all the different choices kind of appearing across our pie chart. So we'll be looking at assessment and the guidance for pupils and how they respond to those comments from teachers and teaching assistants. And it was really good to see Beth, when she was talking about feedback and marking, that her teaching assistant has received the same training around verbal feedback as all the teachers. So there's that consistency and pupils are receiving that quality feedback. So again, keeping our TAs on board with everything throughout this. But addressing misconceptions, and particularly those overgeneralisations, which is where children often can fall down, isn't it, because they've overgeneralised something. So we'll be really looking at unpicking those and trying to plan and using diagnostic questioning to plan to teach to those misconceptions before they arise. So again, through the collaboration of all the schools, it's how do we address, what are the anticipated misconceptions, how do we address them so that the wrong learning, if you like, doesn't become embedded. We'll be looking at examples and counter-examples as well as a strategy to try and address some of those. So then the second recommendation is I think, particularly interesting in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, looking at manipulatives and representation. So where you've got those physical objects, and we're very used to, in primary certainly, in Key Stage 1 particularly, I think are very good at that kind of, actually let's go back to the concrete, aren't we? We've all sort of cottoned on to that idea of going back to the concrete. And I think sometimes it's quite difficult in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 for children to accept that going back to something concrete is actually the way to go, because actually it might seem a bit babyish. I'm having to go and get blocks out, or get the Dean's cubes out, or any of these kind of tools that we have in school might seem like we're taking a step back. Or sometimes teachers can use them for differentiation. So it might be, okay, you're struggling with this element of your maths, so you're going to have these materials, this apparatus to support you, you're not. Whereas what we need is to be scaffolding how to use those. And sometimes if they're not used correctly, particularly in Key Stage 2, where they perhaps haven't handled them for a while, then they can actually cause more confusion than actually unpick some of the misconceptions. But through the guidance, there's lots of strategies, and from the resources from the LAMP project that will be shared across with the team, we'll be looking at some slightly more creative ways of using manipulatives that are actually supporting pupils to think about the pictorial representation as well as the physicality of having something they can manipulate. So we'll be looking at that element. The third one, problem solving. which, I don't know about you, but I remember the days when we used to have the kind of schemes and things that we were using, a few years ago, that everybody was kind of, we did all this and we taught these different concepts and we taught the skills, and then we did problem solving. And it was always this kind of bolt on. And people said, actually, we need to feed it through. We need to be thinking about it all the time. But actually, problem solving in many schools can be often confused with sort of worded problems and actually putting things into context. So what we're thinking about here through the guidance, and as that suggests, it's about actually thinking, what strategies do I have to overcome problems? So what general approaches do I have? So for example, it might be, if I think of a simpler example, a simpler version of this, then that might help me work through the problem that I'm having. And it might be selecting, going back to manipulatives as well. So we'll be looking at problem solving as being actually, what strategies do I need to apply when I get stuck? And that leads us into, particularly with the independence and motivation area of the guidance report. And we're working at the moment with one of our independence groups, which is looking at emotional health and well-being. And they're actually, I think it's actually this afternoon, isn't it, looking at maths anxiety. Because maths anxiety is recognised as a kind of form of anxiety on its own, aside, you don't have to suffer with anxiety to have maths anxiety. It might be just when you're faced with mathematical problems and coming from fixed mindset, etc. So looking at the learning that's coming out of our emotional health and well-being cluster is going to be very interesting, feeding that in, because it's something which is recognised. And how do we address that? How do we overcome that? And how do we know what signs and symptoms to look for in our children who have that kind of anxiety around maths? So that side of things and the well-being of our children will be addressed in that as well. So we'll be looking at all of these areas, but as I said, from the RAG rating, we're hoping that will formulate a direction. Hopefully not too naive in thinking most schools tend to have the same, I know all children are different, but schools tend to have the same sort of issues, and the conversations we have around the county, people seem to be struggling, children seem to be struggling with the same areas and the same things. So hopefully it will form a plan moving forward for us.